The subcommittee will come to order. The chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of opening statements. While the mortgage and home foreclosure crisis has garnered much deserved attention in Congress and in the media, there has been a much less focus on the similar problems that are associated with the purchase of automobiles. Auto repossession rates are on the rise and only getting worse. The National Association of Attorney Generals lists auto issues as among its top 10 in consumer complaints. For poor and working class Americans who do not own a home, automobiles are usually the single biggest asset they possess, and they are essential in getting people to and from work, church, and other places. As such, it is extremely important that when consumers, particularly low-income consumers, purchase their vehicles, the vehicles are, number one, in good working order, and two, affordable, with reasonable financing terms. Unfortunately, evidence suggests that fraudulent practices with regard to both the condition and financing of used cars are on the rise. When it comes to the condition of vehicles, consumers are too often unaware of previous damage inflicted on the vehicle. Cars could have been written off as, quote, total loss, end of quote, vehicles by the insurance companies, sold to salvage yards, and then rebuilt and resold to consumers without them knowing the history of the vehicle. The National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, also known as NMVIDIS, will eventually be a valuable tool to aid consumers in obtaining information about the condition of their vehicles and establishing a database in which states and other stakeholders share their title information. However, NMVIDIS remains an incomplete project as only 13 states are participating in the system, with 14 more, while 14 more provides information, but not using NMVIDIS as its primary resource. Moreover, even when NMVIDIS is fully operational, the database will only have limited benefits for consumers unless the information is made available to them at the point of purchase. Indeed, that is itself a lot itself. Many car buyers, particularly low-income buyers, do not have a computer or internet access to take advantage of NMVIDIS. The FTC's used car rule requires that dealerships disclose warranty information on every car they sell with a buyer's guide posted on the vehicle. I believe that the used car rule and the buyer's guide could be a useful tool to provide customers with branding information on an automobile right at the point of purchase. Consumers are also being increasingly fleeced by abusive financing schemes when buying cars. In most car transactions, the dealership has a dual role. It not only sells the cars, but arranges for financing as well. This one-stop shopping can be very beneficial to customers. And dealerships can play a valuable role in assisting companies in their quest for a creditor. However, too often the dealership and the creditor work together to needlessly saddle customers with high interest rates, loans, or exorbitant fees. Such discretionary practices, known as loan packing and dealer markups, have a disparate impact on people of color, particularly on African American and Latino communities. Dealers will also charge bogus quote, document fees, end of quote, ranging from $400 to $700 for possessing charges of minimal cost. Lastly, dealerships will conduct yo-yo sales where the dealer sends the customer off the lot with a car, only to call him or her back several days later to renegotiate the terms under the coercive condition. Let me close by saying, as chairman of this committee, I would like us to focus our consumer protection missions on matters that particularly affect poor and working class people. Too often, consumer protection issues are driven by upper middle class interests, and not enough attention is given to matters that disproportionately affect low-income customers and consumers. Today's hearing is only one that I hope to conduct that will focus on consumer matters that affect poor people. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I recognize now for 5 minutes for the purposes of opening statements the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Radonovic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you calling today this hearing to protect consumers in the used car market. A car is one of the single biggest purchasers of that consumers make, and although a car is a depreciating asset, it is quite often invaluable to the owner, particularly if it is the only way to travel to work and earn a paycheck. While many in this room live in big cities with mass transit, those of us in more rural areas lack such conveniences. My district is an agricultural hotspot with farms that cover vast acreage in the beautiful San Joaquin Valley in California. And workers are often geographically separated from their place of work by many miles, with few, if any, viable alternatives for commuting. Without a car, getting to work can be nearly impossible, regardless of income, so it is vitally important that they find a safe, reliable car. And the last thing anybody needs is to find out that the car she's purchased has hidden damage that can greatly reduce the car's value, or worse, present a safety hazard to her and her family. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, this committee's attention was drawn to the fact that hundreds of thousands of cars were flooded and should not be resold and put back on the road. And although state laws usually require the title of the damaged car to carry a brand reflecting the car's true condition, unscrupulous people find ways to obtain new clean title in another state, a practice referred to as title washing. With a clean title, the path is cleared to sell the car to an unsuspecting consumer or business. Because of the varying state laws, the NMVITA system was mandated by the Anti-Car Theft Act of 1992 to provide an interoperable electronic system for the states and for law enforcement to improve title efficiency and reduce fraud. However, technological barriers and chronic underfunding have prevented the system from truly helping to eliminate title washing. Recently, however, the DOJ has opened the system to the public and required information to be provided by private sector entities such as insurance companies and salvage yards. And while it's improving, the system remains only as good as the information that goes into it. Unfortunately, only 27 states are currently participating in providing information. And one of them, my home state of California, is not allowing is not allowing the information to be made public. In the interim, American entrepreneurial spirit has filled the information void and produced several competing information products that are commercially available to consumers and businesses to research a car's history. Paying a handful of dollars to research a car for what a consumer will pay thousands of dollars is money well spent. I am pleased that one of the companies, Experian, will be testifying today about their auto check service, and I'm interested to hear whether NMVITA will become an additional tool for the consumer or a replacement to a private sector service. In addition to buying a car with hidden damage, consumers must avoid other pitfalls to purchasing a used car. In fact, a plethora of state and federal laws already exist to inform and protect consumers. The FTC's used car rule requires information of existing warranty to be disclosed through a buyer's guide label on the car. And many states have laws restricting certain fees and mandating additional disclosures. Despite these protections, reports of some abusive sales and lending practices by a small minority of unscrupulous actors still persists. The report comes at precisely the time when many of our fellow Americans have lost their jobs or have reduced income from the slowing economy and cannot afford the additional costs. With many state budgets busting at the seams, the state and local enforcement will depend to protect consumers is susceptible to the constraints of limited resources. And under the economic climate, we must ensure that our laws work effectively to protect consumers and eliminate fraudulent practices that result in unnecessary cost to consumers. Owning a car is an expensive proposition. Financing costs, insurance premiums, maintenance, gas, and state and local taxes require a substantial portion of income for the average American. I don't have to tell my fellow Californians who may see our gas prices increase and vehicle registration fees increase this year to offset our budget deficit. But cars today are also safer, more advanced technologically, and last longer than any time in history. I think any discussion of affordability must also examine the role of the federal and state mandates and taxes. And I also believe that if we want to help consumers, any measure we discuss must carefully examine to ensure that they do not increase compliance costs that only result in higher purchase prices and ownership costs. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you and making sure that consumers have access to the information they need to make an informed car purchase and that unscrupulous actors who would violate the law are brought to justice. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I want to thank the ranking member. Our next member that the chair recognizes is the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, recognized for 2 minutes for the purposes of opening statements.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. You said it rightly when you pointed out that we've had a lot of focus on the subprime mortgage industry and all the abuses that have come to be there. But we're increasingly discovering that there was and continues to be, in many respects, a sort of subprime culture that has developed out there. And the tentacles of it reach far and wide. And in some senses, the place where subprime meets the financial entrepreneur is a place where predators lurk. And it's not just about subprime, it's about, and a subprime culture, it's about an emerging predatory culture. And certainly in the arena of the purchase and sale of automobiles, the potential for abuse is high. There's a legion of opportunities to take advantage of people and exploit people, and that's what this hearing hopefully is going to shed some light on. I expect will come from this hearing with many perspectives, but among them will certainly be that additional protections for the consumer are needed in this arena. And another will be that the depths of this culture of subprime and the potential for predators is very high and extends into many arenas, so we have to be vigilant for what those other arenas can be going forward. So thank you for calling this hearing. I'm looking forward to hearing the testimony from the panel. Thank you.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the former ranking member of the subcommittee, the former chair of the subcommittee. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, is recognized for the purposes of an opening statement for 2 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. As you mentioned, in the 109th Congress, I was chairman of the subcommittee. We examined this problem of title washing and fraud to discuss better ways to protect the consumers who unknowingly purchased these vehicles, and they were damaged. And I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for continuing the investigation. This year, again, we introduced the Damaged Vehicle Information Act, which is H.R. 1257, with my distinguished colleague from Texas, Mr. Green, and I thank him sincerely for his support. Our bill would require vehicle identification number, VINs, of total vehicles to be immediately sent to the vehicle history databases, which would then be made available immediately to the public, so that consumers would be provided with complete information regarding any salvaged or flooded automobile that they may be purchasing. Towards that end, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to put in the record a letter from the Salvage Auto Fraud Reform Coalition, which represents millions and millions of vehicles, and a list of the supporters, including Experian, who is a witness today, including, Mr. Chairman, the National Association of Minority Automobile Dealers, for their support for Mr. Green and our legislation, H.R. 1257. If I put that in the record, Mr. Chairman, by unanimous consent. We are all aware, I think, of what the problem is. And as I pointed out, we have bipartisan support here. We had 80 co-sponsors in the last Congress, and we worked it through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, to ensure this public disclosure of damaged vehicles. DOJ's system, which is NMVITIS, the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, was only recently made available to the public on January 30th, and it's operating off an incomplete database. So NMVITIS doesn't specifically track vehicles that have been damaged and had airbags deployed, and the entry of data on this system often lags behind the time it takes to obtain a new title for a damaged car in another state. Thus, I believe NHTSA is the right agency to be charged with tracking damaged vehicle information. And of course, Mr. Chairman, as you know, this is in our jurisdiction, and we've been a very strong advocate for the consumers. And I thank you for having this hearing.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. Now the Chair recognizes my friend, the Chair of the Oversight Subcommittee of this committee, or the full committee rather, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, is recognized for the purposes of opening statement for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll waive my opening as I'd like to reserve my time for questions.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. The Chair therefore proceeds to recognize the gentleman from Texas, my friend, Mr. Green, for the purposes of opening statements for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on consumer protection in the used car market. There are a number of issues we'll be looking at in the hearing. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on financing scams, title washing, and the ability of consumers to find basic background and history of used cars. Used car scams have been around for decades, but since 2001 in my hometown of Houston, we've seen spikes in flood damage-related fraud after Tropical Storm Allison, Hurricane Katrina, and again last fall with Hurricane Ike. Technology has made Carfax and Autofax reports more accessible, and programs like the DOJ's National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, which more states are beginning to participate in, will help consumers and used car dealers alike. Unfortunately, some unscrupulous used car dealers will remain, and the individuals they will take advantage of will most likely be those who are unable to assess information such as vehicle history reports, or simply don't know it's available or where to find it. The president of the Houston Better Business Bureau stated in the Houston Chronicle article last March that their office still receives 1 or 2 complaints a week from individuals who have unknowingly purchased previously wrecked or otherwise damaged cars. For low-income individuals and families who do not own homes, a vehicle is probably their single biggest asset and depend on it for their income, and can at least afford to pay for repairs or go without that vehicle if it is in the shop. I hope to hear from our witnesses on how we can best make vehicle history information available to all consumers prior to purchase. I also look forward to testimony on abusive practices during the purchasing and financing process. This is something that the subcommittee has looked at less in the past, and then the problems in assessing vehicle history, but there can be just as much fraudulent activity in this part of the process, and it disproportionately affects the same parts of the population. Again, I want to thank our chairman and my good friend from Chicago for holding the hearing. I look forward to our working on legislation to solve that problem. I yield back my time.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gringe, for
Chairman, thank you. In the way of disclosure, I want to say that my dad and my 2 uncles were in the used car business almost all of their adult life, and I would like to have $1 for every hour I spent going with them to New York, to Jerome Avenue, to buy some of these used cars and take them south, or sit around an auction lot for hours and hours while they were purchasing cars. And so I have a lot of interest in this issue. And Chairman Rush, I want to thank you for calling the hearing, and it does affect so many Americans each year. The purchase of a used car, the United States Department of Transportation estimated in 2007 that almost 41.5 million used cars were purchased in the United States. I've got 4 of them. In these challenging economic times, individuals around the country will first look to the used car sector when buying a car to keep their own costs down. It's therefore incumbent on this subcommittee to ensure that individuals have access to the most pertinent, up-to-date information on the cars that they plan to purchase. In 1992, Congress took a large step toward preventing auto fraud, particularly this issue of title washing, when it passed the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System. I also applaud, Mr. Chairman, the work of my good friend from Florida, Mr. Stearns, the work on this issue in both the 109th, 110th Congresses. He introduced the Damaged Vehicle Information Act to direct National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, NHTSA, to provide information about the fair market value and the safety of automobiles. So I look forward to working with him on this legislation and with you, Mr. Chairman, during this Congress. You know, despite the attempts to compel the full disclosure of auto information through NMVTS, I can't say the acronym, there have been a number of obstacles at the state level to get the information distributed. As a result, the private sector, through a number of sources, has been able to fill the void left by the federal and state governments to get vehicle history information, including title and damage information, into the hands of the consumer. It's my hope that any legislative remedy we may find will not undercut the ongoing efforts that the private sector is doing in their endeavors to help consumers. Mr. Chairman, as we move forward on this important issue, we must also recognize the number of existing federal and state laws that address a number of components of the used car industry. I would suggest that we move cautiously on the issue because it's critically important for us to enforce the laws that we already have before adding new layers of federal regulation and bureaucracy. But I know it's a problem. I look forward to hearing from all the witnesses this morning on this important issue. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, my friend from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 2 minutes for the purposes of opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. As has been said, for many people, buying a new or used car may be the largest purchase that they ever make outside of purchasing a home. Far too often, consumers with a lack of resources or poor credit are taken advantage of, and it's our responsibility to ensure that it doesn't happen to anyone regardless of their income. Consumers should have access to reliable and accurate information, even if they don't have access to websites or Consumer Reports magazine. Likewise, they should be assured that when they sign a contract, they're getting the best deal possible, even if they don't have access to a lawyer or financial advisor. It's also imperative that outright instances of fraud are addressed and that the Federal Trade Commission has the appropriate authority and resources to do so. In Illinois, in 2007, complaints about new and used car sales were one of the top 10 consumer complaints reported to the Office of the Attorney General that year. Excuse me. There were nearly 1,500 complaints in 1 year alone. It's clear that this is an issue that needs more attention. I also want to address the issue of cars being sold across state lines with titles that have been cleared of the vehicle's history. These histories may include accident damage or other circumstances such as natural disaster damage that is critical for the buyer to know. For instance, cars that were flooded during Hurricane Katrina had severe saltwater damage, but were sold with titles that did not reflect this history. Salt water can be incredibly destructive to cars, making them more likely to break down. A car in the shop is costing money and isn't getting the owner to his or her job. It's not just a fairness and value issue. There are also serious safety concerns. A California teenager, Bobby Ellsworth, was killed in 2003 when the used pickup truck he was riding in crashed and the airbags did not deploy. The truck had been totaled in a previous accident and resold at auction, but the airbags had never been replaced. The spaces for the airbags were stuffed with paper towels. The National Motor Vehicle Title Information System is slowly being built and implemented by the Department of Justice to share information between states and with consumers. Critical that this effort must move forward quickly. I say in my district we have many public transportation options, but in general we remain car dependent, and it's our responsibility in Congress to ensure consumer protection for auto purchases. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Braley, for the purposes of opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. To my friend from Georgia, I think we've had some parallel life experiences. I have very fond memories of helping my Uncle Lyle Nessero do inventory of parts at his dealership in my hometown of Brooklyn, Iowa. And he worked at that dealership for 60 years. My brother-in-law ended up working with him. And one of the things that concerns me about this economic crisis is the ripple effect it's having on car dealerships all over the country who are being weeded out by automakers who are turning their backs on the dealership network that built their companies in the first place. But I also know that any business and any profession is only as strong as how the public perceives them. And usually it's the weakest links in our professions and our businesses that drive the demand for public action. And that's why this hearing is so important, Mr. Chairman, because we know from the materials that have been provided to the committee, including the letter drafted by my Attorney General, Tom Miller, that there are numerous problems that become some of the most compelling issues that Attorney Generals all over the country face on a daily basis, which is issues of consumer fraud that directly relate to these important purchases. I also, Mr. Ranking Member, grew up and live in a district where there are more pickup sales, I think, than there are automobile sales because of the large agricultural businesses that depend on those vehicles. And so when these purchases are made, they are made in with the understanding and with the good faith belief that the vehicles that are being obtained are going to live up to the representations that have been made. And that's why, even though these challenges are great and the solutions are not going to be easy for many people, the more we do together to create a system where the public and the dealers have faith that the product they are providing lives up to the high expectations of consumers and this government, the more we're going to move toward a day when we have faith in the confidence that those purchases are going to be legitimate, they're going to be dependable, and I think that, more than anything, is going to restore confidence in the U.S. automobile industry, and that's why I look forward to working with everyone here today and making that day come.
The chairman will proceed now to recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 2 minutes for opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll waive my opening statement at this time, and I look forward to hearing the testimony.
Yeah. With that said, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, my friend Mr. Butterfield, for the purposes of opening statements.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this very important hearing today, and thank you for your leadership. Also thank the 6 witnesses for their anticipated testimony this morning. Mr. Chairman, I cannot say that my father was a used car dealer, but what I can say is that my ex-wife's father was a used car dealer. He is a very delightful man who is now 90 years of age and is and was very respected in our community because he treated people right. Mr. Chairman, I live, according to the Hill newspaper yesterday, I live in the 4th district from the bottom in terms of annual median income in the United States, number 4 from the bottom. That means I have a lot of poor people in my district, and so this issue really strikes home to me. The experience of owning a car does tremendous things for a person. Not only does it get them to work, it gives them freedom, it gives them independence and pride. And certainly a great number of people in the U.S. have had this experience, but for some, the experience has not been so great. Many people, including those who have low income, are minorities, or they speak a different language. They have fallen victim to predatory dealers who take advantage of their lack of knowledge and experience when purchasing a vehicle. Of particular interest to me is the abusive financing practices employed by some dealers. Many car dealers, and I have personally experienced this, discourage customers from securing private financing from a local bank. The dealers prefer to finance the deal. They shop around for financing companies that will split a higher interest rate with the dealer, benefiting both the dealer and the financer, but harming the consumer. Another problem, Mr. Chairman, is that some dealers charge excessive fees for processing paperwork. These fees can be as much as $700 on a car that isn't worth much more than that. So, Mr. Chairman, I've run out of time. This hearing today is most appropriate. I thank you for convening it, and I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes my friend from my home state of Georgia, Mr. Barrow, for 2 minutes of opening statements.
I thank the chair. I will waive an opening.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Now we will proceed to the gentleman from, gentle lady. From Ohio, the gentle lady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton is recognized for 2 minutes for the purposes of opening statements. I must apologize, you're far from a gentleman. So the gentle lady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Rush, thank you for holding this important hearing today on consumer protection in the auto market. And for many working families in Ohio, in my district, and across the country, frankly, cars are essential to their livelihood. Consumers in the market for used cars need accurate and reliable information in order to make sound purchasing and financing decisions. And the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System went public on January 30th, 2009. By facilitating the electronic exchange of information between states, insurance companies, and salvage yards, consumers will now have information about the history and condition of used cars they are considering purchasing. The database system will protect consumers from fraud and unsafe vehicles, and in addition, taxpayer savings are estimated to be between $4 and $11 billion annually. Now, I'm proud to note that Ohio is one of the 13 states that's already fully participating in the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System by providing data and inquiring into the system before issuing new titles. But we need to ensure that all of the states are fully participating. And we need to find efficient ways to make the information available to consumers and buyers. Not all consumers have access to electronic media. So I would be interested in hearing from the witnesses today on ways to provide the database services to consumers in addition to over the internet. I look forward to the testimony and the recommendations from today's witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair thanks the gentlelady, and now we will proceed to the matter of the witnesses. We certainly want to, first of all, thank the witnesses collectively for taking out of your busy schedule to be here to share your information not only with the members of this subcommittee and the members of Congress, but also the citizens of this nation. You're indeed doing a great service for our country in that you have taken the time out to come and provide testimony on this very important and vital issue. I want to introduce you now, and then we will have you, as a new custom of this committee, we will have you sworn in for the testimony after the introduction of each and every one of you. First of all, to my left and to your right, those in the audience, is Ms. Eileen Harrington. She's the acting director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection for the Federal Trade Commission. We want to welcome you, Ms. Harrington. Next to her is Mr. James H. Birch II. He's the acting director of the Bureau of Justice Assistance for the Department of Justice. Mr. Birch, we welcome you. Next to Mr. Birch is Ms. Rosemary Shahan. She's the president of Consumers for Automobile Reliability and Safety. We want to thank you and welcome you for your participation. Next, we have Mr. John W. Van Ost. He's the staff director of the National Consumer Law Center. Mr. Van Ost, we certainly welcome you. Mr. Keith Wan is the general counsel of the National Independent Automobile Dealers Association. Mr. Wan, thank you and we welcome you. And last but not least is Mr. Scott Waldron, who is the president of a company called Experian Automotive. And we certainly welcome you for your participation. And now if you would join me and rising from your seats, we will issue the oath. It is Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please let the record reflect that all witnesses, once they've indicated, will have answered in the affirmative. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you so much. I'm going to get this together one day. Very what? Born a judge. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah. Now we will begin with Ms. Harrington for the purposes of 5 minutes of opening statements.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rush, Ranking Member Radonovich, and members of the committee. The Federal Trade Commission's formal testimony has been submitted for the record this morning. My oral statement and any questions that I answer reflect my views, not necessarily those of the Commission. Consumers in the market for a used car need access to truthful information that will help them make good purchasing decisions. The Commission's used car rule helps consumers get some important pieces of information. First, it prohibits dealers from making misrepresentations about the car. And second, it requires them to display a buyer's guide on the used car that they are selling. The buyer's guide conveys to consumers whether the car is sold as is, meaning that the dealer assumes no responsibility for future repairs, or is covered by a warranty. If it is covered by a warranty, dealers must disclose what portion of the repair costs the dealer will pay. Because this information must be displayed on each used car offered for sale, shoppers can walk a used car lot and make immediate, effective comparisons. Since 1985, the Commission has partnered with state and local consumer protection agencies to enforce the used car rule. This partnership has resulted in hundreds of state enforcement actions, as well as 80 federal actions and federal civil penalty orders totaling more than $1 million. In addition, hundreds of state actions have been brought to enforce compliance with the rule, and the FTC has directly supported those state enforcement actions by providing training and investigative assistance. The FTC is currently reviewing the used car rule to examine its effectiveness and to determine whether amendments could increase that effectiveness. As part of our review, we asked for comments, and we've received many thoughtful comments, some from the panelists you will hear from today. Generally, commenters express support for the rule. Some suggest expanding its scope to require broader disclosures, and others prefer to make only minor modifications. I can't comment on the Commission's likelihood of adopting any particular recommendation today, but we will, of course, give all comments careful consideration as the Commission considers next steps. Consumer education materials put out by the FTC encourage consumers to get information about a car's condition by seeking an independent inspection and by checking the car information against the National Insurance Crime Bureau's database of vehicles. These steps can help consumers avoid buying cars that have prior damage. And we are pleased, as some of the members have also indicated, that the Department of Justice's National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, which compiles information from states, insurance carriers, and salvage yards, has recently been made available to consumers. The emergence of these and other publicly available databases can help consumers get accurate information about a car's titling, odometer data, and certain damage history. And the Commission staff is updating our education materials to tell consumers about the newly available DOJ system. And we certainly recognize comments made by some of the members about the digital divide. How to get information to consumers who don't have easy internet and electronic information access is a big challenge, and I'm happy to talk more about that later in questions and answers. Of course, to buy a car, a consumer usually needs a loan. At the FTC, we protect consumers at every stage of the credit life cycle, from when credit is first advertised to when debts are collected. The Commission does this by enforcing Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair and deceptive acts and practices, as well as through enforcement of the Truth in Lending Act. Most recently, the FTC's work in this area has focused on mortgage lending, but the FTC has previously brought 29 cases alleging deception in the advertising of finance and lease terms for cars. In these cases, car manufacturers, dealerships, and ad agencies settled FTC charges that their ads misrepresented credit or lease terms available to consumers. As important as loan origination is, however, it's just as important for consumers to avoid falling deeply into debt on a loan secured by their car. Some debt cycles can begin with an emergency need for cash that is fulfilled by costly car title loans. The Commission enforces the Truth in Lending Act to make sure consumers know the cost of credit, including high-cost payday and car title loans. And the Commission protects consumers who fall into debt by enforcing the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. Pursuant to these statutes, the FTC investigates and brings law enforcement actions against lenders, abusive debt collectors, credit repair companies, and debt settlement firms who target delinquent customers who are in default. Thanks again for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to take your questions.
The chair now will recognize Mr. Birch for the purposes of opening statements. Please limit your comments to 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Radonovich, and other distinguished members of this subcommittee, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to discuss with you today the Department of Justice's efforts to protect consumers from fraud and unsafe vehicles through the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, what we call NMVIDIS. We appreciate this subcommittee's interest in consumer protection by preventing auto theft and fraud. Fraud involving vehicles is a profitable business for criminals and one that burdens states, the auto industry, insurers, and consumers. According to estimates in the 2007 Uniform Crime Reports from the FBI, there were 1.1 million vehicles stolen nationwide. The National Insurance Crime Bureau reports that auto theft alone costs consumers and insurance companies nearly $8 billion per year. In an effort to combat automobile theft and fraud, NMVIDIS was established by Congress in 1992. In 1996, by amendment, this program, Congress moved responsibility for NMVIDIS from the U.S. Department of Transportation to the Department of Justice because the department's overall goal of reducing theft and fraud. NMVIDIS enables users to access automobile titling information, including brand history and certain historical theft data, through a web-based system. It also facilitates the electronic exchange of information between states, which improves titling efficiency and reduces fraud. This exchange of information is particularly helpful in combating vehicle identification number or VIN cloning and title washing, which are significant problems and growing trends in the United States. By making available in one system specific pieces of information from motor vehicle titling agencies, automobile recyclers, junk and salvage yards, and insurance carriers across state lines, NMVIDIS protects states and consumers from fraud and unsafe vehicles. In January 2009, the Department announced the availability of the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System specifically for consumers. This system provides the public with valuable information about a vehicle's condition and history and helps consumers make informed car buying decisions. Through NMVIDIS, once a vehicle is titled or branded by a state motor vehicle titling agency or is determined by an insurance carrier to be salvage or total loss, that data and other important information becomes a permanent part of the vehicle's NMVIDIS record. The law requires that the operation of the system be paid for through user fees and not dependent on federal funding. Therefore, NMVIDIS is designed as a fee-for-service system. Prior to purchasing a vehicle, a consumer can access NMVIDIS through an authorized third-party provider and view information such as the most recent odometer reading, the brand history for that vehicle, the history of any salvage or total loss determinations, and other historical data, including theft data. While authorized providers may charge a fee for their service, consumers benefit from these services that are market-driven and, as of today, do not cost more than $3.50 per successful VIN search. In addition to providing information to individual consumers, the law requires that NMVIDIS information be made available, consistent with relevant privacy laws, to other prospective purchasers, such as businesses that purchase used automobiles or other commercial consumers. Commercial consumers include lenders who are financing the purchase of automobiles and automobile dealers. Lenders, dealers, and insurance carriers are integral components of the automobile purchasing and titling process, and their ability to avoid fraud then protects individual consumers as well. NMVIDIS also serves as a powerful tool for law enforcement. With access to this system for the first time, law enforcement will have direct access to state motor vehicle data in near real time. Previously, law enforcement had to contact individual state motor vehicle titling agencies by phone during business hours to track down title data. With access to NMVIDIS 24/7, law enforcement agencies will be able to better identify stolen motor vehicles, enhance their ability to detect vehicle theft rings, and combat other criminal enterprises that use vehicles. In research conducted at the request of DOJ, NMVIDIS is estimated to save taxpayers between $4 and $11 billion each year. When fully implemented, NMVIDIS will have data from every state and will be queried before any state issues a new title for vehicles coming in from another state. In addition, the system will be available for queries before a prospective purchaser buys any used vehicle. These efforts will protect the American public from title fraud, keep stolen vehicles from being fraudulently retitled, and will make it more difficult, if not impossible, for criminals to clone or conceal stolen vehicles for criminal purposes. This concludes my statement, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. Now, Ms. Sheehan is recognized for 5 minutes of opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman Rush and Ranking Member Radonovich and distinguished members of the committee. I really appreciate the invitation to testify today. I'm very grateful to you and to your staff for the work that you've been doing on this issue. And for 30 years, since 1979, I've been working on behalf of consumers at the state and federal level. And I hear from consumers who have car problems on a daily basis. We have members who have had car problems. We have members who have lost children because they were in unsafe cars. And Representative Schakowsky referred to the Ellsworths, who are members of cars whose son Bobby was killed for lack of an airbag. And they asked that a record that they wrote to Governor Schwarzenegger be admitted to. I would request from the chair and the committee that we could submit their letter for the record.
Hearing no objections to order.
Thank you very much. And their letter asked the governor to ensure that California fully participates in the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System, or NMVIDIS. And California, with some prodding, has begun to participate in NMVIDIS, but it's restricting access to the information to the public. And that's a problem. We believe that it's illegal. We were among the consumer groups, including Public Citizen and Consumer Action, that sued the Department of Justice because after so many years, the Anti-Car Theft Act had not been implemented, and people need it desperately. We need this information more now than we ever have before. And we were very grateful that Judge Patel in San Francisco ruled in our favor and ordered the DOJ, we saw it actually as a rather friendly lawsuit, that ordered the DOJ to issue the final rules, which it did. And starting the end of this month, for the first time ever, the insurance industry and the salvage pools and junkyards will be submitting data to the title system, and it will be made available to the public. And competitive forces then can come into play. The cost of accessing the information can come into play. And in our comments to the FTC, we asked that the information, along with other consumer groups, asked that the information also be included on the used car buyer's guide so that consumers who don't have access to computers when they're car shopping or for other reasons, may not have access to credit in order to get the information from the database, we'll be able to get it on the car at the time of purchase. And according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which commissioned an Academy of Sciences study on where car information is most useful, they said, absolutely, put it on the car. We have the 5-star ratings on cars, the EPA ratings are on cars. That's where people want it. It's where it does the most good. And we're hoping that we can achieve that with Congress's help. And let me just say this. Since I've been doing this for 30 years, the irony we face now is that new cars have never been better. We have the best cars that are being manufactured. We're best known for initiating California's lemon law. That was back in the days of the Plymouth Volare, which, was falling apart bolt by bolt. the cars are better than ever before, but the sales practices are worse than ever before. And not only do we have problems with things like yo-yo financing and, very creative ways of ripping consumers off over their car loans. And I'd like to note for the record that there's a victim of yo-yo financing who's here from Virginia, who typifies what happens when she purchased the car, she thought she had a deal, and about a month later she heard from the dealer, said, you've got to bring the car back, and if you don't, I will report it as stolen. And she actually ended up losing her job because her car was taken from her. Or it wasn't taken, but the tow truck driver showed up at her place of business. And it was a real problem, and she's still having to deal with that. So we have all these problems in the sales of cars that are shrinking our market. It used to be the first purchase people made was a new car. Back in Henry Ford's days, cars didn't last as long. So people would buy a new car, and over time, they would go from the Chevy up to the Cadillac. And instead, what's happening now, most people, their first purchase, especially if they're a young person starting out, is a used car. And if that transaction goes well, all kinds of opportunities open up for them. They get good credit, they have access to better education, better jobs. And if that transaction goes poorly, they may never recover from it. Their credit is hurt. It affects their life for a long time. And we're hoping that that's something that Congress will work with us on resolving. And we also have a new problem that's emerging, and that is so many dealers going out of business with a collateral damage to their customers, where they promise to pay off the lien on the cars they're traded in, and they don't. And you've been hearing about zombie banks. These are like zombie dealers. You don't know from one day to the next whether the dealer you go to is solvent or not. And consumers are buying cars where the liens have not been paid off, end up in a world of hurt when the lien holder repossesses the car from them, even when they make every payment in full and on time. And as Mr. Radonovich knows, this is a real problem in California that we need help with as well.
Thank you so very much. We will have opportunities during the question and answer period. Next witness is Mr. Van Alst. For 5 minutes, you're recognized.
Chairman Rush and Ranking Member Radonovich and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it's an honor for me to testify before you today on behalf of the low-income consumers and clients of the National Consumer Law Center about consumer protection in the used car market. I thank you and your staff for holding a hearing on these very important issues. For years, I was with Legal Aid in North Carolina, and every day I saw working families that lacked a safe, reliable car because of the abuses and problems in the used car sales and finance market. These families lost jobs and they were unable to get their children to school or daycare and to doctor's appointments. Since I've joined the National Consumer Law Center, I've had the privilege to work with hundreds of advocates and attorneys across the nation trying to address these issues, and I've seen just how widespread and common they truly are. And in part, that was the basis for the report that we produced on fueling fair practices, which I've submitted to the committee. And Mr. Chairman, with your permission, if we may have that added to the record as well, I'd appreciate that.
Hearing no objections, so ordered.
Cars in poor and even dangerous condition are sold to consumers as safe and reliable transportation. And this could be avoided if dealers were required by the FTC to disclose known defects and to post NMVIDIS reports on the cars that are offered for sale, and if insurance companies were just required to report all claims data in the United States the same way that those same insurance companies are required to do so in Canada. Consumers are often charged higher interest rates than they qualify for. You see, because the dealers typically arrange the financing, they contact prospective lenders who inform the dealer of the terms on which they'd be willing to lend. Often the dealer puts the consumer in a higher interest rate loan and splits the difference with the lender. For example, if the lender is willing to lend to the consumer at 8% based upon the consumer's credit history, the dealer will put the consumer in a loan at 16%, and then the lender and the dealer split that extra money that will be paid by the consumer over the life of the loan. These markups, as you've pointed out, have a disparate racial impact. Litigation mounted by NCLC and others has demonstrated that minority car buyers pay significantly higher dealer markups than non-minority car buyers with the same credit histories. This practice costs consumers hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, and yet it's undetectable by the consumers and most anyone else for that matter. While the FTC and the DOJ are charged with enforcing the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which prohibits such disparate treatment, they currently lack the tools to know when it's occurring and to combat it effectively. This and other problems could be addressed through the creation of a federal data collection system for auto finance, similar to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. The buying process itself is intentionally structured to be needlessly complicated and time-consuming, to wear down and confuse car buyers and enable dealers to slip in overpriced add-ons and other items that are profitable for the dealer and often not very useful for the consumer. Excess dealer profits are hidden in additions such as window etching, service contracts, rust-proofing, and vastly inflated document preparation fees. Dealers also use tactics such as yo-yo sales, where the consumer drives away in a newly purchased car only to be called back several days or a week later and told, sometimes untruthfully, that financing could not be arranged at the original terms, and the consumer has to enter into a new contract at a higher interest rate or with a higher down payment. Of course, if the consumer, rather than the dealer, had decided that they didn't want to take the car and tried to get out of it, the dealer would have told them the sale was final. Sometimes the dealer will have already sold the consumer's trade-in or tell the consumer that he or she is responsible for extra charges if the new, less desirable terms are not accepted. The FTC, especially if it receives enhanced rulemaking authority, should prohibit such tactics as unfair and deceptive. These abuses and all the other abuses we see in the used car market do not just harm the individual car buyer that gets the bad car or the bad loan. These practices make the entire market less competitive and less transparent. Dealers that would like to deal fairly with the public and compete on price and quality of the car are driven out of business by dealers using these deceptive tactics. And just as we have seen from the problems in the mortgage industry, the inflated cost and discriminatory loans and the outright fraud in these transactions can spill over to the larger economy. While many of the changes that are necessary to bring transparency, efficiency, and competitiveness into the market will have to occur at a state level, there are a number of very important things that the Congress and agencies and the administration can do to stop these abuses. And these changes are urgently needed. The current system results in unfair transactions and hamstrings working families that have to have a car. We look forward to working with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Keith Wham from the National Independent Automobile Dealers Association.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, it is my pleasure to offer testimony on behalf of myself in my capacity as General Counsel to the National Independent Auto Dealers Association here today. My career in the motor vehicle industry has spanned the last 25 years, while NIADA has represented independent, non-franchised motor vehicle dealers for over 60 years. The NIADA and its state affiliate associations represent more than 20,000 dealers located across the United States. We recognize how vitally important the motor vehicle industry is and the impact the used motor vehicle segment of the industry has on our economy. There are currently about 249 million motor vehicles on the road, the median age of which is approximately 8.5 years. There are approximately 40 million retail used motor vehicle transactions per year, roughly split between franchise dealers, independent dealers, and private individuals. Used motor vehicles, because of what they are, carry a history of use and condition. During the process of trade among these vehicles, consumers and dealers alike need access to accurate, timely information about the history and condition of the vehicles. This information affects how much either will pay for the vehicle. This is particularly important to consumers because outside of housing, it often represents the largest single purchase that they will make. In a dealer's case, his ability to pass on timely and accurate information to a consumer means the difference between developing a consumer that will refer new business to him and having a consumer full of ill will who, at a minimum, drives business away from him. It should be no secret that the motor vehicle industry is one of the most heavily regulated in the country, with a maze of overlapping and sometimes conflicting federal and state legislation and implementing regulations. Unfortunately, the good intentions that inspired these efforts have, in large part, created to an increase in the cost of motor vehicles and, in many instances, led to confusion on the part of the consumer and frustration for dealers. Nevertheless, tens of thousands of businesses have developed practices and procedures that allow them to carry on commerce within the confines of those restrictions. Therefore, we do not advocate comprehensive overnight change in this area, but gradual change is needed for the benefit of both the consumer and the dealer. I will be happy, Mr. Chairman, to work on behalf of NIADA with those responsible for making the changes if that should be your desire. My entire professional career has focused on motor vehicles, consumer protection issues, and the motor vehicle industry as a whole. In considering my written testimony, I realized I could discuss dozens of issues affecting consumers in the used motor vehicle industry, including everything from advertising issues and car buyers' bills of rights to spot deliveries and the finance and insurance process as a whole, all of which would have merit. However, I elected to comment upon 4 issues that are currently at the forefront of the motor vehicle industry at the national level: warranties, including what they are and how they're created and disclosed; the FTC used car rule, including the content of the form itself and complications that arise from its completion; financing of motor vehicle transactions; and the tax treatment of a buy here, pay here transaction. Touching on this last issue, in these uncertain economic times, it has become increasingly difficult for capital to flow from lenders to credit-impaired consumers for the purchase of a used motor vehicle. A person's credit can become impaired for various reasons, often as a result of some event over which they have no control, such as loss of a job, health-related issues, or other family circumstances. Likewise, new families just starting out may not have established credit and may have difficulty obtaining financing. For all of these people, a car is not a luxury, but a necessity. Because of these considerations, I'm suggesting that a mechanism needs to be implemented as soon as possible to incentivize sales of used motor vehicles. An easy and inexpensive way to accomplish this is to permit used motor vehicle dealers, like similarly sized businesses, to utilize a modified cash or installment sale method of accounting for transactions with the dealer's finance for their customers. Permitting such modification would provide customers with impaired credit or no credit access to additional financing sources for their used motor vehicle purchases. While preparing for this hearing, I could not help reflect on instances where, at least at first impression, cooperative resolution of competing issues might not have seemed possible. Working with the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration on the implementation of the Anti-Car Theft Act of 1992, with representatives of the IRS to develop an audit technique guide for the used motor vehicle industry, and with representatives of the FTC in interpreting the FTC used car rule and publication of a dealer's guide to the rule come to mind. In each circumstance, work by dedicated people with differing points of view yielded an effective result. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to participate here today and will answer any questions later as time permits. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Waldron, you're recognized for 5 minutes for opening statements.
Chairman Rush, Ranking Member Radanovich, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today regarding the protection of consumers shopping for a used car. Today, I'll discuss how the timely disclosure of total loss vehicles can help protect consumers, as well as what Experian Automotive does to help inform consumers and businesses in the used car market. Experian is an information services company that's a leader in consumer credit, marketing services, and electronic commerce. Experian Automotive, based in Schaumburg, Illinois, works with consumers, manufacturers, dealers, auctions, finance, and insurance companies, and people throughout the automotive retail channel. Our national vehicle database, housing records on more than 600 million vehicles, along with Experian's credit, consumer, and business information assets, meets the growing demands of our industry and consumers in providing valuable information in a timely and cost-effective manner. Experian is similar to other business units, or Experian Automotive, rather, is similar to other business units in Experian in that we analyze and compile third-party information to help consumers and organizations make good decisions. One piece of information not usually available in a timely manner is when an insurer declares a vehicle a total loss. It can take up to 60 days to be registered in state titles. In that time, the vehicle is likely to have already been sold to an auction, then to a dealer, and then on to a consumer. This is information that both the dealer and the consumer would want to know before they bought the vehicle. To ensure that information on vehicles declared a total loss is disclosed in a timely manner, Experian believes that total loss information should be made commercially available and has and does support legislation requiring the disclosure of vehicles declared a total loss. Switching now to how Experian helps protect consumers and dealers in the used car market, I'm going to discuss the AutoCheck Vehicle History Report. AutoCheck is designed to help consumers and businesses make better vehicle purchase decisions by quickly and easily understanding key vehicle events. Using the Vehicle Identification Number, or VIN, an AutoCheck Vehicle History Report reveals frequency and location of title and registrations, title brands, accidents, odometer history, and a number of other things for consumers. The information comes from many data sources, including state departments of motor vehicles, auto auctions, police accident reports, salvage yards, and so on. Compiling information from many sources allows AutoCheck users to view significant information about the vehicle in a single, convenient format. Consumers, dealers, auctions, and manufacturers access AutoCheck information via the AutoCheck and other partner websites and directly through asking dealers for a copy of the report. The extensive use of AutoCheck in the wholesale market by automobile auctions and dealers enables the parties to more quickly decide on a fair price. Now, while vehicle history reports are important, confusion often remains over the relative significance of various pieces of information presented in them. To help quantify and weight various pieces of information, Experian Automotive developed a rating methodology based on statistically valid models. The result is the AutoCheck score. This number compares a particular vehicle to others in its class and age range in order to help build confidence in a purchase decision. It leverages Experian's continuously updated vehicle database in combination with the company's expertise in data analysis to provide a single number score from 1 to 100 for comparison purposes, making it easy for a buyer to understand what information they're looking at. Attached to my prepared testimony are 2 examples of AutoCheck vehicle history reports. The first one you would see shows a clean vehicle, and the second one shows a vehicle with title issues. My last point is that there are numerous ways Experian Automotive works with public and private organizations to improve titling and brand disclosure. For example, Experian's been working with the National Insurance Crime Bureau to combat vehicle theft rings. We provide information to them at no charge to detect fraud in vehicle identification numbers, including VIN cloning and counterfeiting. NICB has disseminated 290 leads since August of 2007 based on data provided by Experian. From these leads, over 100 vehicles have been recovered with a combined estimated value of about $2 million. In conclusion, the business model for Experian Automotive is to provide businesses and consumers with relevant information from a wide variety of sources in a timely manner. The information in the AutoCheck Vehicle History Report and, importantly, the AutoCheck score helps consumers know whether or not the car is a good deal for them. On a personal note, Experian is in business to be successful, but nothing is more personally satisfying to me than the emails, phone calls, and letters we get from consumers thanking us for helping them pick the best car for them, or more importantly, helping them avoid a car with a troubled history. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions on any of this.
The Chair thanks the gentleman. The Chair recognizes himself now for 5 minutes for the purpose of questioning the witnesses. But before I proceed, I would like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement by public citizens and the testimony of Mr. William Broke, the Director of the Consumer Protection Division in the Iowa Attorney General's Office. Hearing no objections, so ordered. To all the witnesses, we certainly hope that the Invitus system will be a useful system when it is fully implemented. But it is only available online. Its use will be limited. A shopper comparing several cars at a used car lot may not be able to leave the lot, find a computer, and log on to access information about the different cars. At some point, buyers may not have a credit card to even pay for this report. Now, several of you mentioned in your testimony the value of having this information available to buyers at the time of the sale. And I'd like to explore for a couple of moments how this could be done. Ms. Shahan, you recommend that adding Navitas information to the buyer's guide that is currently required to be posted prominently on the car, that this will help. Is my assessment of what you recommend, is that correct? And can you explain why this is the right place for this information to be displayed on the vehicle?
Yes, Chairman Rush, you're totally right. We strongly recommend, and we have for a long time, that there be disclosure on the used car buyer's guide. And it won't apply to cars that are private party sales, but we believe that consumers have a different expectation. When you walk onto a car lot and you're buying a car from a licensed dealer, you tend to think that it's different from buying from Joe Schmo in the street. So since 1985, the Federal Trade Commission has required all used car dealers in the country to post a used car buyer's guide on the car. It's very minimal in the level of protection it gives consumers now. It could be far more valuable if it also included whether the vehicle was in the National Motor Vehicle Title Information Service as having been salvaged. And, you know, if I had my way, actually those cars would be segregated on the car lot and like cordoned off so that they are not mixed in with other cars. Because these are cars that overwhelmingly, with very rare exceptions, pose a real safety hazard to the public. They may have bent frames, like the Katrina cars, the flood cars, if they're saltwater flooded, all the electronic systems in those cars are going to corrode. They're basically rotting from the inside out. There's no way they can possibly be made safe. And a car with a bent frame, if it's an SUV, it's very likely to roll over in an emergency braking situation or even in just in normal use. If it's in a subsequent collision, the cars today are built with unibody construction so that they, in order to protect you, have to have some structural integrity. And if they've already been in a crash severe enough that they had to be totaled, chances are very good that they don't have that same structural integrity.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your answer. Let me move on to Mr. Birch. Mr. Birch, you noted that DOJ is exploring methods of access that do not rely on the internet or credit cards. Would you please care to elaborate?
I will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have talked with each of the consumer access providers that are currently making access to Navitas available to see if they have the business processes established to accept requests for payment via mail, where it could be provided via check, et cetera, or some other type of payment process that does not involve commercial credit. They are looking into that and have promised to get back to us, but we are also looking at other options as well. In particular, we know that some of the nonprofit organizations that are dedicated to addressing these kinds of issues specifically, particularly the consumer organizations, we've asked that they consider being a consumer access portal provider. We would like to facilitate that. Additionally, we've asked the states to consider being a consumer access portal provider where consumers can walk up to the counter and pay for and request a Navitas search there in person, which clearly would not require credit. So we've looked at all of those options.
Sure. Thank you. Mr. Wan, in your testimony, you expressed some concerns about including Navitas information in the buyer's guide, arguing that dealers could be liable for gaps in the Navitas database. Would you, first of all, is that correct? And would you please explain it more?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think everyone can agree that a car that's been damaged and been repaired improperly is unsafe and shouldn't be on the road. And cars that have been in a flood or had saltwater damage, that's the most insidious. The problem isn't necessarily with the disclosure of the information, but the problems it causes. If Navitas was a database that was comprehensive and everyone had access to it, dealers would be happy to pass on the information that's available to them. The unfortunate reality is this database is being updated on an ongoing basis. So when a dealer takes a car in on trade or purchases one and completes the FTC sticker, that information might be accurate at that time, and the very next day may be inaccurate. We also have concern that consumers would rely too heavily at this point on information that is not going to be complete. And therefore, if a statement posted on the motor vehicle is there, it's going to be considered an advertisement under the state's Unfair and Deceptive Practices Act, and the dealers are going to be liable for the untruthfulness of the report that they can't control. I think NMVIDIS is a very useful tool, and I think there will come a day when there will be access and we can talk about that type of disclosure. We just don't think we're here yet.
Thank you very much. That concludes my time is up, rather. So I will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Radonovich, for 5 minutes for purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all the witnesses. Thank you for your testimonies. Pleasure to have you here today. I'm going to start off with you, Mr. Waldron, if I may. I've got a couple of questions about NMVIDIS and how, you being somebody who's in the business as well and the relationship that you might have with that company or with that reporting system. What would be the NMVIDIS system? What would it do to existing contracts that you have to purchase data from states, salvage yards, and insurance companies?
At this point, we're continuing to work with the states and all of those companies, and we don't see a specific difference under NMVIDIS itself. The total loss disclosure, on the other hand, would give us the ability, if we can get that on a consumer basis, to put that out into our AutoCheck vehicle history report. So that would be very helpful for us.
I think what you would like to see is NMVIDIS be a resource to you for you to be able to gather the information just as much as you gather the information from the state of California or from salvage yards or the like.
That's correct. NMVIDIS would, in doing that, make a good source of information. We have, in the past, as you mentioned earlier, filled that void. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, we put out a free database so that consumers could check to see if their vehicle that they might consider purchasing had been in the hurricane zone at the time of the hurricane. That was before the states or insurance companies or anybody else could do anything. At least we could offer consumers a level of protection to say, check this for free and see if this vehicle might have been here, to let you ask more questions.
Do you view NMVIDIS as being a threat to your private enterprise? or?
As it's written, we do not view NMVIDIS being a threat because we provide a lot more information. Should NMVIDIS continue to morph into something larger and larger and larger, it could certainly become competitive with what we're doing in the private sector.
Very good. Thank you, sir. Is it Juan? Mr. Juan, I've a couple of questions. What cost do you or the manufacturer bear for compliance due to state and federal laws? And does the consumer bear these costs in the sale price of the vehicle?
Well, I think any costs, obviously, that relate to compliance with those type of issues at some point are going to be rolled into the cost of doing business. Mm-hmm. So there are some costs, such as title and filing fees and some of those type of things, that are directly passed on to the consumer. When we talk about things like documentary fees, most of those are established by state law except those that don't have caps, and therefore that is like any other charge that could be levied.
That's a vote call. You can choose to. You can talk through it.
Okay, thank you.
It goes on all the time.
So those charges are not passed on. But I will tell you, with the amount of regulation that's been placed upon car dealers in particular, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the Safeguards Rule, disposal information. I'm sorry to get this down. The red flags rule, the cost of compliance today is immeasurable. You couldn't go and put a dollar amount on it. Cost of compliance is cost of doing business, and it is not directly passed on to the consumer. But realistically speaking, it is included in the cost of doing business.
Can you give me, too, a sense of how much the consumer pays in state and local taxes and fees in the average purchase of a car? Can you give me a ballpark figure?
It varies across the country. I know that in some states, documentary fees are less than $100. In probably the vast majority, if you looked at an average, it may be in the $250 range. There are some that don't cap them, And, you know, we've heard some research or testimony today that could run as high as $400 to $700. I don't have any research to suggest that. You know, taxes, obviously, the sales taxes on the car, and then title and filing fees are usually, I'll say nominal in the terms of thousands, but when you're buying a car, every $10 or $20 bill in there, if you can't afford to buy the car, obviously is significant.
Adds up. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Wan. I have one more question for Ms. Harrington. Is the FTC equipped with the manpower to enforce its used car rule, or is it enforcement better left up to the states?
Well, as I indicated, the FTC has partnered from the beginning with the states, and it really depends, I think, on the market and the size of competitors in the market as to whether it makes best sense for state and local government to take the lead or the FTC. In Chicago, for example, for a long time, we have partnered with the Commissioner of Consumer Services and sometimes with the State of Illinois Attorney General's office to join forces for used car rule enforcement.
Last question is, are violations of the used car rule a problem of national scope or widespread in nature, or so widespread in nature that it fits into the FTC's prioritization?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There's a vote going on right now. We have 12 minutes and 20 seconds left. We want to proceed to Ms. Schakowsky for 5 minutes. The chair does intend to have a second round of questions if members would want to return. But there is a vote. I think there'll be 4 votes in succession. So the chair will recess the committee and subcommittee and then come back for an additional round of questions if we don't complete our round of questioning, the first round, before we have to depart for votes. The chair recognizes Ms. Schakowsky for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Harrington, you said in your testimony that the Commission will give careful consideration to all comments suggested amendments to the used car rule as it determines next steps. Have you heard anything today in the testimony that would suggest that there ought to be changes to the rule?
What we've heard today, I think, is reflected in the comments that we've received. So I haven't heard anything today different than what we've seen in the comments.
And so what is it that you might be contemplating changing in the used car rule?
Well, there are questions that we always look at when we do a rule review about whether there are changed market conditions that should require consideration of additional provisions in a rule. There are questions about whether the rule is needed. Is this the best approach? When we do rule reviews, we start with the very basic question about...
Right, well, let's see if there are other concrete suggestions here about changes to the rule, so we're sure that, if there's anything new you've gotten it. Mr. Van Alst?
Thank you. There are several changes that we certainly recommend, and we have submitted comments on behalf of our low-income consumers for changes that we think would be most effective in the used car rule. You've already heard today that they're very...
Just keep going.
Very urgent need to make sure that the results of the Navitas would be available to consumers at the time that they're looking at buying a car, and the best place to do that is to have it directly on the car. Currently, the used car rule doesn't really disclose much about the car other than the existence of the warranty. And certainly, even NIADA previously in its comments earlier back in the early 80s on the used car rule said that there would be a fair balance for dealers to disclose known defects to consumers as part of the used car rule. So certainly what we see here is a lack of balance of information, things that the dealers know and the consumer don't. And so if we could make that a part of the disclosure to make sure that if the dealer knows there's a defect with the car, they ought to go ahead and disclose that at the time that they're selling the car.
So that seems to be a common theme of what information ought to be available on the car. I imagine that a number of the comments include that. Is that something that you're considering putting in the rule?
Certainly.
Okay. Let me ask about other federal issues that we could address. Minimum standards nationwide, for example, for title brands. Example, a state like Arizona might not have a title brand for flood damage, but obviously it's not a common reason for cars to be destroyed in that state. But the absence of a flood brand made such states ripe for title washing after Hurricanes Rita and Katrina. Let me ask Ms. Is it Shahan? Do you believe that there should be minimum standards across the states for assigning the title brands most important to consumer safety?
I think that's a complicated issue. And I wish I had a simple answer for you, but you know, the title brand is not that helpful for consumers, frankly, because consumers usually don't see the title before they buy the car. Most consumers are getting a loan, so the title goes to the lien holder. And the disclosure to the consumer, really, you know, having it on the car buyer guide is far more useful. And what we're hoping is with NIMVITAS, since insurers are going to be providing data on all the cars they totaled, regardless what's on the brand. And there are some insurers, you know, who have violated the law and not properly branded titles even when they're supposed to. If they're captured in NIMVITAS anyway, then a lot of these problems about title washing across state lines or lack of uniformity get addressed because you have uniformity by virtue of having uniform access to the same information regardless what goes on with the brand. And that's one reason we felt so strongly about, you know, having DOJ issue the rule. And frankly, we're not really anxious to have DOT and NHTSA get in on the act. We believe that properly DOJ should keep that program and keep implementing it. If we want to tweak the law and tighten the time frame for insurers to report the data to NIMVITAS, great, let DOJ handle that.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Sarbanes, you are next. However, we have about 6 minutes, 41 seconds. If you want to, the chair will wait with you for 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I'll try to dash over there when I'm done.
Okay, Mr. Sarbanes is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm most interested in the financing part of the discussion that you presented today. And I'd ask you, Ms. Shahan, and Mr. Van Alst to maybe describe what you view as the most egregious practices when it comes to the financing of autos. Yeah.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Obviously, many of these practices are difficult to easily describe, but there are a few that I think in just a sentence or two I can explain to you. We see a lot of the same things happening in car finance that we've seen create such problems in the home mortgage industry. We've seen when someone goes in to buy a car, there's fraud involved in the applications. There's fraud involved in the amount of the down payment that's represented to the lender. And the reason all this arises is because the incentives are so skewed. The incentive for the dealer is to get this deal done, and especially if they can get a kickback from the lender, if they can increase the amount of the interest rate, they go ahead, they make more money. They don't have any interest in whether or not the consumer can actually pay for this car. So obviously, their incentive is to get the deal done, and it really hampers any efforts to try to make sure that there's a fair transaction. In the same way that appraisers, created false appraisals in the mortgage industry created such a problem, a lot of the current flaws in trying to get accurate information about these vehicles, whether or not there's damage, creates the same problem in this instance. If you buy a car with significant damage that you aren't aware of, well, it's really going to make you either unable or less likely to make your payments, 6 months down the line when the car either doesn't run or you've had an accident because of the frame damage.
Who are the financing companies that are doing this? I mean, describe some of the financing entities that are in the mix here.
There's a range. There are some very large national financing companies which were predominantly the defendants in the class action lawsuits that I mentioned that we had regarding dealer markups and their disparate racial impact, where they were charging higher dealer markups to African Americans and Latinos. And But then there are also a number of regional finance companies that do a smaller business. And then, as was alluded to earlier, there are also the buy here, pay here places where the dealer is financing the purchase of the car there on the lot. And there the business model really is to try to get a down payment. That's the full price of the car, and any payment the consumer makes is kind of gravy of that.
Are those loans are those finance companies packaging those loans and selling them up the line, like we've seen in the mortgage industry? And where are they selling them?
They're securitized and sold on Wall Street the same way the mortgage.
Have you seen any evidence, as we saw in the home mortgage industry, of people at the higher levels putting pressure, having an appetite for those securitized loans that translated into these financing companies going out and looking for more subprime borrowers?
That's the business model, pretty much, yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm going to cut short my questioning so we can get over to the vote, but my interest is in the hidden hand here. And we can focus a lot on the consumer protections that are required for that, you know, on the car lot transaction, and those are very important. But when it comes to this subprime culture and the predatory lending that goes on, you can trace it back, or you can trace it up to players who would probably have familiar names based on the inquiries we've made into the home mortgage arena. And I'm very curious to see how far, where the fingerprints of this hidden hand are. And we're seeing it in the auto industry, as we saw in the home mortgage industry, and there's probably other places as well, and so the inquiries will continue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Chair, thanks to the gentleman. The Chair will please invite the witnesses if they will remain. We have a series of about 4 votes, and when we come back, we'll conclude the first round, and then if there's interest, we'll have a second round of questions. So I would just beg you to please remain with us for a while. Thank you so much. The committee stands in recess now. We will convene 15 minutes after the last vote. the committee will be called back to order. I want to thank the witnesses for your patience. And now, without any further delay, Ms. Sutton, you are recognized for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin. Sorry for being late. Mr. Birch, as I indicated in my opening statement, Ohio's made the investment and is fully participating. It's on here. Mr. Birch. Ohio is fully participating in the National Motor Vehicle Title Information System. But under the rule, states aren't required to fully participate until January 1st, 2010. Do you expect that all 50 states in the District of Columbia to be in the system by January of 2010?
Yes, ma'am. That is our expectation at this time. We've had conversations with states, and I know that some of the states have concerns about meeting that date, but we've assured them that we will work with them, make it a priority to work with them to meet that date, and AMVA, our operator, has also assured us of the same.
Okay, and just so I can get a little bit more clarification, there are 10 states described in your testimony as in development. Can you just tell me what that means, where things stand?
Yes, ma'am. In development means that these states have established a timeline for establishing their participation either at the data provision level or their full participation. They've established a timeline, they've identified resources, and are actively working towards meeting those goals. And so my understanding is that some of those I apologize. Are you asking about the gray states in development, or the 10 states in development, or the states that are not participating?
The 10 states that are in development, and then, of course, there are 14 that aren't participating at all. So I want to know about them both.
Okay. So the 10 states in development have identified a timeline. They have identified the resources. They are working towards participation. And it's my understanding that as soon as within the next 90 days, some of those states may have completed some of the initial processes, and their data may begin to be contributed to the system. In terms of the 14 that are not participating, as I mentioned previously, we have had conference calls and meetings with a number of those states, and we are now in the process of arranging individual conference calls and consultations with those states to identify in which ways we can be helpful to them in meeting the January 1, 2010 deadline. I also expect that some of those states may have submitted a proposal. We had recently had a solicitation on the streets to provide some funding support for states that are not participating to bring them online. And it's my understanding that some of those states may have also applied for those funds.
And what about California, who isn't, who's providing data to the system but not allowing it to be shared with the public?
That is something that we are working on a daily basis right now with our with the point of contacts in the California Department of Motor Vehicles. I think, as has been mentioned already, this is the subject of a federal district court order that requires us to work together with California and with the plaintiffs in the litigation to try to resolve these issues. Right now, our timeline is to have these resolved by the end of this month.
Okay, and if I could just move quickly, Ms. Harrington, I'm a bit perplexed by some of the answers that you've given to questions earlier in the discussion. Following up on Ms. Schakowsky and some other things that I've heard here, the used car rule does not require the disclosure of the condition or history of the vehicle, even if the dealer is aware of specific defects, correct?
Right.
Okay. And last year, the FTC sought public comment regarding the used car rule. And in your testimony, you state that the Commission is currently giving careful consideration, and you restated that here again when you were asked about if you heard anything here today. And of course, then Mr. Van Alst gave us a lot of information here, whether or not that you heard anything here that would change or add to your determination. And I didn't really understand your answer. You just said we consider a lot of things, and I guess I'm just perplexed about what you know, the comment period closed 4 months ago. What is your time frame for making a decision?
This is a rule review. It's not a rule making.
Okay.
The time frame, I would expect that there will be a recommendation for the Commission shortly. the requirements for rulemaking under the Federal Trade Commission Act are not the same as the requirements for rulemaking that most agencies use under the Administrative Procedures Act. The Federal Trade Commission Act has very cumbersome and slow procedures in it, and so I can't give you a timeline if the Commission should commence a rulemaking because much.
Okay, but when are you going to make decisions about the comments that you've received?
Well, as I said, the staff should have a recommendation for the Commission, I would think, within the next month.
Okay.
I'm not the Commission, so I can't say when it will make decisions. But what I want to caution on is that the provisions in the Federal Trade Commission Act that govern rulemaking are such that, for example, in the original rulemaking under the used car rule, that went on for years because interested parties have a right to request hearings, and then the Commission has to conduct hearings in numerous locations and make available for cross-examination all interested parties.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of time, but I'm hoping that we'll have opportunity to follow up. Thank you.
There will be a second round of questioning. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Masui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for calling today's hearing. I'd like to thank today's panelists for sharing their expertise with us today, and I'd especially like to welcome Rosemary Shahan to our panel. She comes from Sacramento, and her organization, Consumers for Auto Reliability and Safety, is well respected and widely viewed as one of the country's leading voices on car condition issues, and I'm really happy she's here today. One of the questions I wanted to ask was about subprime car financing. My home district of Sacramento is among the hardest hit cities by home foreclosures. And unfortunately, like many of our homeowners, California car buyers were also victim to predatory car financing loans. Many consumers were steered into subprime car loans. I understand that some auto financing practices closely resemble the predatory lending practices that have affected so many homeowners. Thus, I think this is a good opportunity to shed light on how these issues are intertwined. Ms. Shahan, what are the parallels between the problems we've been seeing in the mortgage industry and the auto loan finance industry?
Thank you very much. There are many parallels between home mortgage lending practices and car lending practices. And one of the biggest things that they have in common is that there's an incentive to get consumers into loans that aren't really in their best interests or don't appropriately reflect their credit worthiness. And there's a disparity very often in auto loans between the rate that consumers should get, which is the buy rate for the car, the rate that they actually qualify for based on their credit, versus the rate that they're given because there's a hidden undisclosed charge for the consumer in the form of what's known as the dealer markup. And it's very similar to what you see in home mortgage lending, where the brokers have an incentive for raising the interest rate. The dealers have actually made this a major profit center for them. And part of why it's such a problem for consumers is that it's not disclosed, and it's, the Federal Reserve found that even when there is some form of disclosure regarding this, that it's confusing to consumers, it doesn't work. And we would like to see it just flat out prohibited because there's a conflict of interest there that consumers don't perceive. And very often they're led to believe that this is the best rate they could qualify for, and they're sometimes flat out told, we shopped you around for credit and this is the best rate you could get, when it's not.
Okay, well, thank you. Mr. Van Elsa, I understand that some are suggesting that the government create a data collection system to track for auto financing loans. What uses would such a system serve?
Numerous uses. One of the problems we have, as Rosemary Shahan pointed out, is that consumers don't realize when this happens to them. They don't know that they're the victim of really a conspiracy between the lender and the dealer. And also, those of us that are trying to combat this practice and trying to make sure that minorities aren't especially harmed by this practice by even higher dealer markups, it's very difficult to do that. In fact, I mentioned earlier that NCLC had been involved in some cases regarding this very issue. And I would point out those were the first sort of private enforcement cases regarding disparate impact under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 30 years. And the reason we don't see that happen more often is because it's incredibly difficult. You can't just have sort of anecdotal evidence and show that there's a discriminatory impact. You actually have to have statistically significant evidence. And in our case, you know, it was over $1 million up front that people had to put to get all this information together and get it analyzed. And it involved a lot of sort of very tenuous, well, not really tenuous, but very difficult connections, drawing the lines between the loans that were made and then looking at states where there's racial information on driver's licenses and things like that. So trying to connect all those points with the information we have present is almost impossible. And as I pointed out, you know, the FTC and the DOJ are certainly charged with enforcing the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and this would be a tremendous tool for them and for others who are interested in these issues.
Well, could I also ask you, are there any market-based solutions that can properly address some of these subprime car loans and car condition abuses?
Well, there are real efforts. There's some tremendous organizations. Opportunity Cars is sort of an overall blanket organization that has a lot of member organizations that provide cars to low-income folks at reduced and subsidized rates. But that's not going to do it if we look at the scale of the problem across the country. Credit unions, the direct loans to their members used to be sort of the credit union's bread and butter. And what we've seen in the past 10 or 20 years is a huge shift where they're now predominantly making these loans indirectly through the dealerships. And these loans are much worse than the direct loans that the credit unions made previously.
Well, thank you. I see everybody on town. I'll follow up in my next round. Thank you.
Thank you.
The chair thanks the gentlelady, and now recognizes himself for a second round of questioning for 5 minutes. And each member who wishes will be given 5 minutes on the second round. Mr. Van Alst, you highlighted earlier a litany of financing abuses that used car dealerships employ to fleece consumers, yo-yo sales, markups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Does empirical evidence show that such predatory practices are widespread and also on the rise? And in your opinion, how has the FTC handled these abuses? And what suggestions do you have for mitigating any problems or abuses in the future? I know you might have answered that before, but I want to give you a chance to expound on it a little bit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There, I guess, sort of a multi-part question. I'd be happy to try to answer all of those. Right. I think there definitely is empirical evidence as to the disparate impact of these markups on minorities. And the empirical evidence that we have comes primarily from those cases I was mentioning earlier that we were able to actually review hundreds of thousands of these transactions to show what was taking place. Unfortunately, I can't answer whether or not that's something that's increasing or anything else about it, because that really is information that's not available to people absent one of these very large, difficult sort of litigation efforts, and it's not something that you can find out without going through that process. That's one of the real problems, and certainly I think that's one of the reasons that maybe there's not been as much enforcement by the FTC and the DOJ of protections regarding disparate impact, is because you can't really get a handle on it without that information. Mm-hmm. We've got a wonderful tool that the FTC, does use, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, looking at issues such as this in the mortgage arena. Unfortunately, they don't have that same tool in the arena of car finance. Mm-hmm. And so while I think that there are failings on the part of regulatory agencies to perhaps enforce mm-hmm. some of these laws, it's understandable when it's difficult to track and difficult to really combat these issues with the tools we have available right now.
Yeah, Ms. Harrington, do you feel as though the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act is a model that can be adapted to disclose information relative to automobile purchases and discrimination in automobile and exploitation in the automobile retail industry?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know what the implications of requiring disclosures by lenders in the car finance area would entail fully. I think that the network of lenders and finance companies involved in auto finance is larger and in many instances operates on a more localized basis than much of the home mortgage financing does. So I can't say with confidence what would be involved in putting a broad disclosure requirement on all entities involved in auto finance the way that the Congress did with the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. I will absolutely agree with Mr. Van Alst that without the HMDA data, we would have a very difficult time finding evidence, getting the data that we can analyze to determine whether there are Equal Credit Opportunity Act violations in home mortgage lending. And, you know, we don't have a good source of data in the auto finance area.
All right, thank you. The chair has concluded his questioning. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for an additional 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question again for Mr. Wan, if I might, on the issue of cram down or court-forced lowering of loan principals. If that were to come into effect in the auto industry, with the people that you represent, the auto dealers and those wanting to sell cars, and you 9 times out of 10 you got to arrange financing for the people that are buying the cars. If cram down were in effect in the automobile industry, would that what kind of effect might it have on your auto dealers? And if you've got an opinion on the banks that provide auto loans as well for the consumer.
Well, speaking on behalf of the auto dealers, you're going to take something, essentially a receivable that they're going to collect, and it's going to be worth much less, stretched out over time, and the interest rate adjusted. Given that this primarily affects not the average used car dealer, but somebody in the buy here, pay here industry, that would probably upset their business model and likely put them out of business. Now, hopefully, when they're engaging in these types of loans, you hope the portfolio is good. It's your own money that's in the street. And based upon the research I've seen in the buy here, pay here industry, the average consumer puts down roughly $1,000, and the average cash-in deal for the dealer is somewhere between $4,000 and $4,500. So if, in fact, the dealer who's already paying tax on the income before they receive it, so the dealer essentially has an interest-free loan to nobody, they're going to pay tax on the income, and then if, in fact, somebody, for whatever reason, winds up in bankruptcy through no fault of their own or not, and the loan is crammed down, that dealer's going to be squeezed on both ends.
Both ends.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that, in your opinion, do you think banks would be less or more likely to lend if court-ordered cram down was in effect in that industry?
I would say that they're probably less likely, but I will tell you, based upon a lot of the testimony I hear today, I obviously am experiencing something different than maybe some of the other people who are testifying. Because in the industry that we have with the independent dealer, we're having trouble getting lenders. So our biggest challenge right now is having lenders who will finance a transaction. We don't have finance reserve that's going to be 8 points or 5 points. I mean, if there is finance reserve, it's 1.5 points or 2. We feel very strongly that service contracts are something of value at a fair price because the consumer doesn't have the money to be able to pay for the car if something goes wrong. A gap product may be there. But beyond that, we don't have anything to sell to the consumer. You've got the front end of the deal, the profit from the car sale. You've got the back end from the finance and insurance process. Our biggest challenge is getting banks that want to do business, not to work so hard to have a customer come in and get them financed and have them leave to bring them back for some sort of false circumstances. That's not my experience.
I see, I understand. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton, for an additional 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Shahan, in your testimony, you note that members of the armed forces are particularly vulnerable to deceptive financing, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record an American Foreign Press Service article from July of 2000 written by an Army reservist who also works for the FTC. This article details many of the same harmful lending practices we've heard about today and the shameful frequency with which they seem to target military personnel. Ms. Shahan, based on your testimony, it appears that little has changed in the 9 years since the article was written. Can you explain why car dealerships or how car dealerships are targeting military personnel? What makes these individuals particularly vulnerable to yo-yo financing and other practices?
Yes, thank you for asking. This is a problem that's really near and dear to my heart. I was married to a Navy JAG for 20 years, and it's actually why I got involved in working on auto issues. Instead of being a college English teacher, I had a personal experience. And the reality is that when you're in the military, a lot of times you're young, you're away from home the first time. This is the first time you get a major paycheck, you're on your own, and you are also vulnerable because a lot of times you have a security clearance that dealers will threaten, and they'll say, we put you into this car, the financing didn't go through, we want you to come back and sign another contract on worse terms, sometimes a bigger down payment, higher interest rate, or both. And if you don't agree to this, then they'll say to you, we will report you to your command, and we will make you lose your security clearance. And this is a serious problem for our troops. When there was a hearing in California before an assembly committee, members of the armed forces came and testified regarding financial readiness issues in our state, where more troops are deployed from than any other state. More are stationed in our state and deployed from California than anywhere else. And it's a disgrace that they're being treated the way they are and that there aren't better protections there for them. And they testified that yo-yo financing is one of the worst problems that our troops encounter, that auto sales are the single worst financial readiness problem that they encounter. The Navy Relief Society and others also back that up with their testimony. And
can you explain what financial readiness means?
It means that the troops are expected to keep their financial house in order to be ready to serve our nation. And we have an obligation to them, obviously, to protect them while they're protecting us. And we have situations like in Arizona at Fort Huachuca in Tucson, where the fort actually had to resort to calling, determining some dealers were off limits because they were preying on the troops. In every military base in the United States, there are rings of payday lenders and schlocky car dealers. And, it's a really serious problem that affects morale and readiness and their ability to accomplish their mission.
I thank you for that answer. And if I could just, Ms. Harrington, I sort of see you weighing in. Can you tell me, I know that the FTC has a military sentinel program that's supposed to help members of the armed forces and their families who are facing financial problems even as they serve our nation. What actions is the FTC taking against auto dealers for these kinds of scamming practices?
Most recently, we've gone after payday lenders, which, as Rosemary indicated, also ring bases. We get very few complaints about car dealers and car finance. We got 1.2 million consumer complaints last year. 2,400 of them were about car financing. I would venture to say probably none of them, or few of them, came from military members. They don't complain. We've been out trying to encourage the service offices on bases to please get the complaints to us. We send our regional staffs out to work on military installations, both on education, but also, again, to encourage complaints, but we don't get them. And I think some of the reasons are ones that Rosemary mentioned, that there's sometimes there's a culture of not complaining and not coming forward. And, I know from your experience legislating in other issues that getting people to come forward when they are victims when there's a culture that discourages that is really a challenge.
Well, I appreciate that. The reality, though, is, of course, I'm coming forward on their behalf, and the fact that the Judge Advocates General stated that auto purchasing is the single worst financial readiness problem facing troops in California, and we know it's probably not isolated there. We need to find a way to address this in a more effective manner. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes of additional questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to start off, the question is for Mr. Birch, Wand, and Waldron. Maybe just a commentary on Navitas. As I understand, Navitas, which was enacted or created in 1992 as an anti-car theft act, right now it does not specifically track damaged vehicles that have had airbags deployed. And as I understand, it does not cover individuals or self-insured owners that are required to provide information, Navitas. And I guess the question is, in the overall scheme of things, title washing and other acts of fraud, is there a better way than doing it perhaps through NHTSA than Navitas? This might just be a general question. Mr. Birch.
Thank you, Congressman. I think we're working diligently to analyze now where the gaps are in the information that we're preparing to collect. I think, in looking at where we're headed and looking at what the rule allows us to do, we know that there are some gaps now, but we expect that by January 1, 2010, when we have all states on board, we have all junk, salvage, and insurance carriers reporting to the system. We include certain self-insured entities will also be required to report. You're correct in that we don't have...
you don't have title washing now, right?
I'm sorry, sir?
You don't have title washing? You don't prevent or keep track of title washing and other acts of fraud?
The system does address title washing. And Title II of the Anti-Car Theft Act was, I think, focused on preventing fraud, and in particular this issue of brand washing or title washing. And so that is something that the system is currently protecting against, and as we get additional states on board and additional providers sharing information, we will address that issue even more comprehensively than we do today. You are correct in that we don't collect damage estimates. We do collect total loss determinations. So if an insurance carrier makes a total loss determination, or if a state titles a vehicle as salvage, we will have that information in Navitas.
Okay, but you don't have it now. And Mr. Wan?
Unfortunately, we face many of the same issues today that we faced back when the Anti-Car Theft Act was enacted. I think back to when Dick Morse convened the advisory group after the passage of that, and when myself and Gary Dickinson did an educational session for them on titling and title washing, and we have the same problem then that we have today.
Here we are 17 years later, and we're still talking about it.
Exactly. We still have, I think it's probably safe to assume we're not going to have a national title. So if we're not going to have a national title because we have 50 different ways of doing this, what we have to make sure we do is that we capture title brands and that we carry them forward state to state.
Yeah.
Because if we don't do that, the system is only as good as the information in there. Self-insured information needs to be trapped, and of course, any safety item is critical. We can debate what's frame damage on a unibody car, but we know when an airbag has been deployed, if that could be trapped and passed on, we could make sure it's been repaired properly.
Mr. Waldron?
We actually do have that title and registration information across all of the 50 states and have had it for a number of years. And within that data, we do track for title washing. And one of the things that we do is that we have all 50 states, and we have a giant grid of every brand in every state to understand how those work, you know, and which one is what. And those brands, once they're put on the vehicle, will always carry with the vehicle in our auto check vehicle history report. So they carry across today. So we do that. We do not have all of the total loss information as we spoke of earlier, so that obviously would be a big help if that becomes in the commercial realm. And we also have many, many accidents. I do not claim that we have 100% of the accidents in the United States. No one has that. But we have a significant number of the important or major accidents in the United States across all of the different states that we pick up from many sources, government and non-government, and we report those, and those always stay with the history of the vehicle. So that's why we think it's so important to look at something in a comprehensive basis. We do have that today. What we do not have in the Invitas level is real time going back and forth. We get it. Sometimes that data is today, sometimes it's a day ago or up to like a week ago, but we do have data from every single state.
Mr. Chairman, is this at the time you're doing the second round of questions?
This is the second round.
Is it possible I could have additional time since I only asked one? In other words, you allowed members to have 2 times?
The chair will.
You give me additional 3 minutes.
No, I won't give you 3 minutes.
Okay, how about additional 2?
I'll give you additional 1 minute, okay, for another question, and we'll offer that to any other member who wishes to take advantage of it. Witnesses have been here for a while now.
This is for Mr. Waldron. There's a lot of talk about the importance of total loss disclosure for buyers. What happens to a shopper when he's just coming across a car? Should this information be available to the shopper before even getting to the buying process? If you don't mind, just touch base on that.
Sure. We think that's very important. There was a lot of conversation today about when somebody's actually buying the vehicle, and it's sort of you're fairly far down the path when you're looking at that. What we talk about with AutoCheck is that you can use this thing in the shopping mode. You can buy an unlimited number of reports for $25 and use it for 60 days to look at as many vehicles as you want to look at, and therefore you can sort out vehicles that have title problems or other issues that you find unacceptable while you're in the shopping process. We think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, because lots of people would be in the buying stage if they saw this information when they were shopping.
Correct. And that's why we offer it in the way that we do, and we also we want to shift the cost burden as much as we can to the retail channel, to the dealers as part of what they do, and it makes sense, and dealers buy from us. Oftentimes, all the reports on all their vehicles expose them all the time, both online and in the dealership. And one of the things we say to consumers is if the dealer won't give you one of our vehicle history reports, walk or run away.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Sutton for an additional 1 more minute of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to give Mr. Van Ost a chance in his statement. You touched briefly, I'm sorry, you touched briefly on the cumbersome rulemaking process at the FTC. Do you want to just take a moment and elaborate on that?
Yes, there is, and certainly, as we've heard today, the current process which the FTC has to use to do rulemaking is difficult and cumbersome and time-consuming. And we would certainly not oppose, a regular APA rulemaking for the FTC. However, I think if that were to be the case, there would certainly come with that ability to have such a rulemaking, a responsibility to use that rulemaking effectively and to try to go ahead and move on these issues that we recognize have been with us for years and years and years, and we haven't really effectively ended yet. So while we certainly think that rulemaking would be helpful, we'd like to make sure that rulemaking is used effectively and really combat some of these practices that we've discussed today.
Thank you.
The chair really thanks the witnesses for your invaluable testimony here. You've been a superb group of witnesses, and we just again are sorely indebted to you for your time and participation. And we want to just note that the members will be given an additional time to submit written questions. And please be prepared to answer these questions should you receive them. So we, again, want to thank you so much for your time. And this committee now stands adjourned.